Yeah, I'll just say I was here to listen in because I'm curious, guys. But since it's publicly noticed, I didn't think there was going to be any OMA issues. But if you're worried about it, I can peace out.
No, you're great, Zach. I was just saying we needed to open it up so that we were out on the open side of it. So we're good. Thanks for being here.
Thanks.
Yep. Hi, everyone. I know you're connecting. We will get started in just a couple minutes as we allow folks into the room. Just to note, we are recording, so please be aware of that, and then we will go through our slides shortly. Thank you. And staff, we'll give it about 2 minutes. So it's 6:02. We'll go ahead and get started, just recognizing that folks are probably clicking on the link and getting connected. Hey, everyone. We'll get started in a couple minutes. You probably heard me just say that. And please go ahead and mute yourself. You're welcome to leave your camera on, and we'll go through kind of the expectations for the webinar before we begin. But just to remind folks, we don't want to have audio disruptions where folks can't hear. So you're welcome to keep your camera on, but please mute. Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? I don't see anybody else joining right at the moment, but we'll welcome folks in as they come. So welcome, everybody. Good evening. We are today joined by the three sponsors of the Home Initiative, Housing Opportunities in the Municipality for Everyone. This is our community webinar that we are recording on Monday, March 4th, 2024. And we are sharing information about the Home Initiative and really kicking off our public engagement process that we anticipate going through the summer. So thank you, everybody, for being here. So first, I just want to say hello, and then I'll turn it to my two other presenters today to say hello, starting with Mr. Volland.
Hi, everyone. Hey, thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity to explain more about this legislation. I'm Daniel Volland. I represent North Anchorage.
And hi, everyone. I'm Meg Zaletel. I represent Midtown in District 4, and I really appreciate your interest and wanting to know more about the Home Initiative. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm Anna Brawley, representing West Anchorage District 3, and also excited to have folks be here. And then I'll just remind folks to mute as you join.
I was gonna guess.
Sorry, we hear somebody who just went to Houlihan's. If you could mute your line, thank you. So I'll also say that we are joined by our legislative services staff, Claire Ross, our legislative services director, and Allie Hartman, our assembly communications director. So you'll see them on the line as well. And also they can be technical support in the chat if you're having an issue. So first, before we dive in, we just want to set some expectations. These are obviously most relevant to folks who are joining us live versus watching the recording, but hello to those in the future. These are just some reminders for us. First, this webinar is public. It's being recorded. The recording will be posted on the municipality's YouTube page after it is done. So we'll get that sometime this week, and you can go back and watch it or share it with others. Also, for folks on Teams, as I've said earlier, Please remain muted during our presentation so that everybody can hear and stay engaged. And then we also will ask staff to mute folks if there is a disruption or if somebody is causing noise on the line. The next one is important, be respectful of all participants. That includes anything in the chat as well as to the presenters. So hopefully we don't have to do this, but staff does reserve the right to remove somebody if they were causing a serious disturbance. I'll also remind folks that the Teams chat is not part of the recording, so it will not be posted publicly, but we are using it to collect questions throughout the webinar. So please post your questions there. The questions themselves will be copied over so that we can keep them and respond to them. So please use it that way, but be aware that that will not show up on the recording. And then we will be doing a Q&A at the end. Staff will read a selection of questions from participants, but just to note, we are collecting all questions. So even if we don't get to it today, we will be looking at them. And if a question is more appropriate for agency staff, we will be forwarding it as well. And then also we will be posting an FAQ. So we'll get into that a little bit later, but just expectations for how you can engage during this webinar. And then lastly, I will go through our brief agenda for today. So first, we're going to share some context, basically answering the questions, why focus on housing policy and how our zoning change is a key part of our local solutions for our housing issues. Second, we'll talk about a big picture overview of the home initiative. So what's happened so far. This ordinance was introduced last year, so just making sure folks are up to date on the timeline, what's happening now, and then what's next at the Planning and Zoning Commission in March and then into the future. 3, we'll spend some time getting into the details. So really looking at what the ordinance proposes, not just AO 2023-87S that we'll get into, the original ordinance that was introduced last year, but also really looking at the draft that we've prepared and is part of our planning and zoning packet, which includes a first kind of draft proposal of all those details, things like setbacks, all the rules that go with zoning districts. And then lastly, we'll come back to what happens next with our public process and engagement. So letting you know exactly how you can participate in the process, the Planning and Zoning Commission, as well as engaging with us and really scheduling meetings and to have more conversation about this, because this is really the beginning of the conversation, not the entire thing. And then lastly, we'll get into time for Q&A. So I'll note that we're scheduled between now and 7:30. So we will be as expeditious as we can and make sure that we move forward with our content and then also make some time for questions at the end. So with that, I will kick it over to Daniel.
Okay, great. Thanks, Anna. So why the focus on housing policy? This is a big priority of the Anchorage Assembly, and how our zoning changes a key part of our local solutions. They aren't the be-all, end-all. We know that, but we believe that they are one tool that can be tweaked to address housing in Anchorage. Next slide. So Anchorage needs more housing, and we need housing for all of our essential workforce, whether that's teachers or baristas or engineers. Everybody needs to be able to have housing within their budget. So here's an example of a school teacher. Where can Mr. Lewis live within 1.5 miles of school? And this is something that staff looked at. They looked at local listings for rent, and then looked at the annual salary for a new Anchorage School District teacher. And so you can see that most of the rent in the area that staff was looking at exceeded Mr. Lewis's budget. We've seen an increase in the average listing price in Anchorage, the rent increase. We also have a very low vacancy rate. And then I think disturbingly, UAA students experiencing homelessness. So this is about our future. It's about making it possible for more people to make Anchorage home. Too many people are leaving, even people who grew up here. And so we see these challenges in our economy, workforce, education system. What is the community that we want to be? We want people to want to live here and for it to be possible for them, should they choose Anchorage. A little bit more about that UAA example. Before the pandemic, 8% of UAA students in a survey were estimated to be homeless. So that means couch surfing, living in their car, or just being unstably housed. So these are all indications, all all indications point to the fact that these statistics got worse during and after the pandemic, along with food insecurity. So it's sort of a worsening problem with our university students. And next slide. So the Anchorage Assembly, as I said, is working on addressing housing. The Assembly, along with the mayor and many other partners in the community, have made housing a priority. And this is a little blurb of the Assembly's housing vision. Long story short, we want more housing. We want more options, diverse housing options that fit the needs of everyone in our community. So that could be cottage houses, small multifamily, supportive housing for those that need it, housing for seniors, retirees, starter homes for families, condominiums, apartments, etc. You know, in all of our work that we have been doing over the last few months on this issue of housing, we have identified several issues. Very little new housing has been built over the past decade. And almost all of that is either subsidized housing or high-end homes. So we really are missing that middle market rate housing. We have an aging and deteriorating housing stock, changing demographics. We have the issue of short-term rentals, which the Anchorage Assembly is targeting through separate legislation. So that's something that we're looking at. We have a lack of smaller units, despite the fact that you know, we're seeing more smaller households, 1 or 2 person families. We really need more of those smaller units. And then just the expense, the general construction expense, building, renovating, reusing, converting, it's all very expensive right now. So a lot of challenges. I will turn it over to Meg for the next slide.
All right, so as Daniel said, Anchorage needs more housing. And so we know that if we look back in time, our housing shortage is not a new or sudden problem. It's just one we've really failed to address. And so it's increased in terms of its urgency because it hasn't been addressed with urgency before. If you think about the Anchorage Bowl, which is what the home initiative addresses, there is not sufficient vacant buildable residential land to accommodate the demand for new housing units forecasted over the next 20 years. If we don't change anything, it relies on the historic density of development. Building mid-rise residential and mid-rise mixed-use rental developments is typically not financially feasible in our current market. We're having a hard time getting any building, let alone mid-rise units. So what do we do? And that's really a big question here. What do we do? Next slide, please. Well, what we need to do is figure out how to build more housing that's affordable, especially for people with limited resources or young adults and elders. And when Daniel was talking about the types of housing, I always want to just add, it's not an official type of housing, but aging in place. To me, that is something that's on my mind, probably as being a former estate planning lawyer, but aging in place. I think that's a really important piece to this. And we need housing that's attainable for people who want to build a life here and maintain a life here. Again, I'm back to that idea of when I get older, or that aging in place, our income tends to decrease again as we get older or go into retirement. And then affordable housing is usually subsidized. And what I know about subsidized housing is it's really complicated and it's really hard to make pencil. And it relies on rental subsidies to operate. There are very limited rental subsidies available in Alaska. So we have to think about how we can make attainable housing feasible to build. That's where we have to start. A project has got to be able to pencil out a level that results in attainable housing. Otherwise, we're going to have to rely on something else to make it a viable housing opportunity for most of Anchorage. Next slide. And so what do we mean by attainable housing? You'll see that we're using this word instead of affordable housing. So affordable housing targets low-income individuals. Attainable housing is economically feasible for a middle-income population. If you kind of think of the top 20% and the bottom 20%, you take the middle 60%, that big part of the bell curve, that's who we're talking about. How do we make sure that housing is attainable and economically feasible for most people in Anchorage? And it's really bridging the gap between high-priced market rate residences and government subsidized housing. We sometimes we talk about home types and the missing middle. This is the missing economic middle of housing. If you look at these prices, $456,000 to buy the average home in Anchorage in 2022. Attainable housing prices would look more like $264,800 to purchase a home in 2002 at 80% of area median income, or at 120% of area median income, just under $400,000. So we're still outpriced by more than $55,000 from obtainable housing, even when we get up to 120% of the area-wide median income. So if we don't change something, we're pricing most individuals out of the market by what we do continue to build. That, I think I will turn it back over to Anna.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just add as well, you know, we do need housing across the spectrum. I think that's really what we've been talking about. And as Meg said, the market has been taking care of those high-end homes. And then there's certain subsidies that can go with lower end homes. But really what we're focused on is why is the market not producing housing? It's not lack of demand. It's not lack of interest. It's not lack of having folks in our community who know how to do that, right? Our industry folks. And so it's really trying to figure out what the barriers are. And as Daniel said, you know, we've been working on our housing action plan. We know there's multiple barriers. There's things like infrastructure costs, the increase in interest rates and financing challenges. There's a whole host of things, but it's not an either or, right? It's an and. And so we are focused on zoning because we know that is a key part of the problem. And that's not unique to Anchorage. There's certainly a lot of communities grappling with the issue of having mostly low density, most of their land zoned for low density or single family housing. And then we also know there's just things in our zoning code that make it more expensive to build. And I don't believe that was the intent, but that is the impact that it's having. So briefly on this slide, you'll see just a short one data point, and we can certainly provide more, but we want to get focused on our ordinance. Essentially, the new Title 21, the zoning code, went into effect in 2014. It was worked on for about 10 years before that. If you look at this graph, we're looking at MOA building permits. So not buildings that are completed, but really permits that were pulled. And you'll see a spike right around 2014 and 2015. Really what that was the 1 year overlap between when the old code could still be used and then when the new one would go into effect in everywhere except downtown, essentially. And so what happened, and we've heard this from builders, they pulled as many permits as possible for any project that they might work on in the next several years, with the idea that it could be under old code. And again, not because they didn't want to build things well, but really because they knew how much more expensive it would be. And so really looking at how we evaluate basically the impact that our current zoning code has had, the economic and the financial impact, because I think it bears out in both the building permits and then the number of units that we've been building for the last 10 years or so. So before interest rates went up, before supply prices went crazy with COVID, even before really our recession, although that certainly had an impact as well. And then I'll just note also, we'll come back to this, but the land use plan was created after our zoning code. And so the idea that that we need to look at what our big picture plans are, our comprehensive plan, our land use plan, and then drilling down into our zoning code to implement that. That's really where we have been looking back to our plan and saying, what have we already done? And then where could we go further to actually implement the goals of this plan? So again, not the only factor that affects feasibility of housing, and it is a key part of our housing supply and we've heard that from folks who actually use our code. So developers and planning professionals, when this code went into place, documented many issues with it. There's also been a study of real life local projects kind of comparing old code and new code, found that it added about 10 to 20% of the cost, particularly for, again, these more attainable rentals or small compact housing for sale. So that is really part of our issue. We've also heard over the years, for folks who have been on the body longer than I have, many projects that are just impossible to build. So a lot of folks wonder, why is that vacant property not turning into something productive? Why is that older building not being reused? There's probably many answers to that, but one of them is that we've made it so difficult from a regulatory standpoint and so expensive that the consequences that properties don't change. And the other thing to note, and where we'll get into in more detail with the ordinance, overly complex code in itself has a cost. It has a cost for folks to understand it, which can even include professionals who use it every day and who often charge by the hour. It's difficult to administer by staff, and then it's really difficult for property owners to even determine, what can I do with my land? And so again, there's multiple layers to untangle here. This is one part of it, but this is one place to start, which is how do we simplify our residential zoning code? And then I will turn it back to Meg.
Thanks. One thing I would add to the overcomplicated code is the reputational costs, right? Our code has a reputation of being hard to deal with. There's a cost associated with that with folks who just don't want to engage, whether it's from the private individual who doesn't want to make those upgrades or build that ADU, or a developer who wants to maybe come to Anchorage and is hearing that the code is hard to deal with, and so therefore doesn't want to engage. So those reputational costs are really important. So the home initiative, why we are here, big picture policy, it is a look first from kind of the 50,000 foot view down into the 30,000 foot view. It is policy, and then we get into the details. So it is really important to keep those kind of different levels in mind. So let's talk about where we've been and where we've headed. So next slide. So what spurred the home initiative was all the way back in May of last year, I made a pretty substantial proposal to just kind of reduce us all down into a residential zoning district. I wanted to start a conversation, and boy, did I. But what was really great about that is it got everyone thinking about what's possible. And what was possible was bringing forward streamlined residential zoning based on the 2040 land use plans, land use designations. Member Volland saw what was being proposed and said, hey, here's this thing that was already predictive. We're already aware of it. It's in on a map. So let's just marry these two things. And to me, that is the secret sauce to making good policy, is one idea comes with another one and you move forward together, with that refined idea. And so the changes to be would be implemented, right? We go from the policy change, which is to use land use designations in lieu of the current R system. That's kind of the higher level, right? Simplification. Go from the R's to actual words, which are the land use designations, and then we get into the actual changes to be implemented through Title 21, and that's the more specific detail. Next slide. So walking us through, 2023-87S was introduced in late August. This is really where we start to talk about the land use designations as the new consolidated zones. We worked with zoning consultants, and we prepared a draft ordinance that really filled in a lot of the details. And that was shared with the planning staff in early January. We've been meeting with the planning staff and the mayor's office about kind of where we're at in the process and discussing the process together. We have a public engagement plan. Member Brawley has done significant work on a very robust public engagement plan that involves all of us, as well as making sure that the planning department is aware of all of those instances. And so that's pretty much where we're at. We're in this public engagement process leading up to the Planning and Zoning Commission case, which is coming forward on March 18th. It will have a work session and then move into the Planning and Zoning typical meeting where it will be heard. That will then sit with Planning and Zoning until Planning and Zoning makes a decision. They have up to 90 days. But regardless of what advice, because remember, it's a advisory commission to the assembly they give, it is scheduled to come back before the assembly on June 11th of 2024, which should include the updates from the planning and zoning recommendations and any other changes, that we and planning maybe talk through, want to make in response to both the planning and zoning recommendations and community input and feedback. So that's where we've been, where we're headed. So I'm just going to highlight those dates again, those big dates, which is where the public engagement is in a formal way. One is the planning and zoning case on March 18th. And that's a Monday night. It happens at the library. And then the other is June 11th, again, at the library on a Tuesday night. Thanks, Anna. Next back to you.
Yeah, thank you. And just briefly, the other thing that we want to communicate here, and also hopefully to set up conversations that we want to have with you all, with organizations, community councils, folks over the next few months, both before and after planning and zoning's hearing, is some general guiding principles. So we'll come back to these when we talk about the ordinance in more detail, but just wanting to note, these were kind of the way that we thought about this work, both at the high level and then really moving into decisions about what we put forward as the draft, what we're calling the details, the dimensional standards, those other pieces that need to be addressed in Title 21. So one, we've already talked through. Number one, upholding the land use plan, looking at those land use designations. Two is making the code shorter, simpler, and focused on the intent of those plans. Three, we wanted to, and again, we'll get back to this, looking at those dimensions, really try to use the least restrictive of the zones being consolidated, with the idea that we, again, want to make housing easier to build, especially infill housing in these areas where they need revitalization, where we can fit more housing. Four is to really keep the good, functional, and low-cost parts of Title 21. So I mentioned, we're not throwing out the whole code. This is not a full code rewrite, but it is a complex regulatory structure. There's lots of pieces that fit together. So really, where we can and where we have not seen that they have a huge negative impact, we want to keep those. And that's, again, part of the conversation going forward. And then also, as we said, simplifying the code doesn't just help us today. It really helps create a more streamlined and easy to understand regulatory structure for updates, right? For new things that need to be discussed, for other conversations, and really allows for more flexibility. Because what we found, and if anybody has worked with our code, that it can get complicated. You pull one thread and then all the rest of it starts to get tangled or untangled. And so really wanting to reduce kind of the unintended consequence of when you start trying to change one thing and then you have to deal with the rest of the code. So back to you, Daniel.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, the sponsors, we are really keen on this legislation implementing the recommendations and being guided by the 2020 comprehensive plan and the 2040 land use plan. And I will talk about sort of how those things work together. First of all, the 2020 comprehensive plan, that's like the umbrella, the parent document, so to speak. And so here you can see some excerpted goals that we believe kind of fit into this legislation. Number one, general land use, that there would be a forward-looking approach to community growth and redevelopment. Residential uses, that there would be a variety of housing types, like I mentioned earlier, and densities in safe, attractive neighborhoods. Neighborhood identity and vitality, that there's a variety of safe, pleasant, and distinctive neighborhoods that are responsive to the diverse needs of residents, and a balanced, diverse supply of affordable quality housing. And the preferred scenario given by the plan, the urban transition, and it provides that downtown, midtown, and older in-town neighborhoods develop a more intensive urban character. Initiatives to foster more intense mixed-use development and neighborhood renewal in the northern half of the bowl are introduced. And then suburban or rural neighborhood character in South Anchorage is retained. So as we go forward, you'll kind of see that in what we've planned here, this consolidation of residential zones, there still is a gradation of density, larger lot residential, less dense in South Anchorage, and then toward the urban core, an increase in density. Next slide. So here's kind of how two plans, publicly adopted plans, work together. Like I said, there is the comp plan, the Anchorage 2020, and then also the land use plan. So Anchorage 2020 kind of sets that broad vision for how are we going to grow as a city. And then the 2040 land use plan, it provides that blueprint that guides future use. What types of intensity can we have where, and what does the character of that growth look like? Both of those plans then can inform our zoning code, our municipal code, so Title 21, right? So the Anchorage 2020 Comprehensive Plan is the parent, like I said, of the Anchorage 2040 Land Use Plan. Both guide the implementation of and changes to Title 21. Title 21 text amendments can be made, but should be consistent with the plans or plan amendments that are adopted concurrently. An interesting thing here, though, is that Title 21 actually predates the land use plan, which was completed in 2017. So I think that there is potential to modernize our zoning code, still in conformity with our plans. The 2040 land use plan seeks to improve capacity and types of housing. It recommends future land uses and a range of potential intensities of use. So the plan gives sort of a range of intensities. However, it is zoning in our municipal code that regulates and sets the rules for the use of property, lot size, setbacks, building heights, and other site attributes. So again, the 2040 land use is kind of that blueprint. The 2040 land use plan anticipates that over the next 25 years, more people will be in starter homes, moderate income or downsizing households, and that as a result, people will be looking for smaller, more urban residences with walkable neighborhood amenities nearby. The sponsors believe that the majority of the 2040 land use plan policies do support simplifying zoning, and that simplifying zoning in support of the 2040 land use plan can help address the growing housing demand in Anchorage and provide more affordable housing options for residents, while still retaining that predictability and continuity with existing neighborhood characteristics. Next slide. And I think with this next slide, we're going to give it back to Anna.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just pause very briefly to remind folks that if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We will be doing a Q&A after we get through our presentation. But as questions occur to you or you want to make sure to get them in there, our staff is monitoring the chat, and then they will be collecting all the questions so that we have them and then can pull some out to be addressed in this webinar. And then in addition, we will be doing an FAQ and also hopefully having meetings with you all in the near future. So just to remind folks as we continue to go through. So now we are going to get into the details. So we're going to give a brief overview of what's actually in AO 2023-87S, as well as basically the full documents in the packet before planning and zoning, which includes a draft ordinance that does not have a number, but really goes through and gives, as Meg said, going from the 50,000 foot down to the 30,000 foot, and then really on the ground what that would look like. And then I will also emphasize the word draft again, because this is really what we have put forward for discussion. It's our starting point. And so, we feel like these are a good set of numbers that are defensible to work from. But we anticipate that these will change, and you'll see a couple notes in here where we anticipate making recommendations to P&Z of changes to what was originally published. So with that,
real quick, Anna. Yeah, just to kind of reiterate what Anna said there, one of the reasons is it's a draft is because we want public feedback. We are sort of putting this out there. What do you think? And that is subject to change, but that's part of this public process that we're going through. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Great point. Okay, so going through this again, these are the guiding principles. Just to note, when we're talking about the original ordinance, AO 2023-87S, that was really getting to the first two of our guiding principles. So those big picture ones, that is putting forward and saying this is the policy that we recommend. And so with that, we'll go through kind of some of the details. So just to note, in the land use designation, this is a screenshot from the 2040 land use plan, and it shows as we said, the names of the items that we are proposing as zoning districts. It also has basically where those land use designations correspond with existing zones. And again, this is current Title 21 because the plan was adopted after the rewrite of Title 21. So these are more or less what appear in code now. And so that was our starting point. And you can see that it does transition from large lot residential all the way up to urban residential high, which would be, for example, downtown or areas like that. So that's really where we started with this. And then I think, sorry, just double checking. We want to go through kind of what those translate to. So again, large lot residential would be what is currently R6, R7, R8, R9, and R10. And this is again the way the draft, the original ordinance, and then our new draft is written. Next is single family and two family residential. So that would include R1, R1A, R2A, R5, and then I have a note about R2D. We'll come back to that one, but I just want to note there's a reason it's in both places, going back to our land use plan. The third one is compact mixed residential low. So that would be possibly R2D, although we'll come back to that again, and R2M. Number 4 is compact mixed residential medium, which includes R3 and R3A, and then urban residential high, which includes R4 and R4A. So again, that's what you'll see in the original ordinance from last year, and then also carry forward into this new draft ordinance. So then the zoning districts, though, have many components, right? So there's not just that big picture, but there's things like the allowed uses, the types of housing or the types of uses you could have, lot coverage, setbacks, meaning how close or far from the edge of the property you can build a structure, the allowed height. Some properties you have to think about septic, right? They might not have or they might not be connected to piped water and sewer, so they have to have on-site systems which have their own rules. Some properties have slope issues, right? That's a big issue in hillside, but also other properties that are on steep slopes and would limit where you could build. And then, of course, there's other considerations in our zoning code as well. So really, without going fully into kind of, land use planning 101, those are really the things that we think about when we talk about zoning, not just what district you're in, but also what you can build there, what your building can look like, and then, as we said, other kind of regulatory considerations. So then we will get into, so essentially the 2023 ordinance laid out the big picture. It said, here's the proposed new zones, here's language around them, and then here are the equivalent zones that would be basically replaced in code. And then it had effective dates, which we'll talk about later. And again, that ordinance is still also being considered. But really where we want to go today is to give information about these details. So looking at the last 3 pieces of the guiding principles, really, how did we decide what numbers to put forward? And it was looking at the dimensions of the current zones that we are discussing consolidating, and then where possible using the least restrictive standard. So again, trying to have a logic to the way we made these decisions, but again, not pushing beyond that, right, to say, we believe that within the current zones, there is a good range of options here. wanting to keep the good, functional, low-cost parts of Title 21. So you'll see that that in some parts of the ordinance or the draft ordinance, there are things that are deleted, but actually what happened is they are being relocated to other sections. So we'll go through that as well. And then, of course, adjusting the code to be more flexible. Again, thinking about how can we keep the principles in the code, but not necessarily the level of complexity that's there now. So again, easier for people who use the code every day, including our staff. So then we will go through essentially what we would call a sectional summary. So this is to help you orient you to, again, the draft ordinance, the unnumbered ordinance. But also I'll briefly touch on the effective dates. So if you're following along, we did not list page numbers because we anticipate that the draft will change, right? So just making sure that you can track the sections. Our ordinances are broken up into sections. So the first one, you'll see section 1 really has conforming changes. So there's many places where the residential zoning district names appear in code. And so there's some places where you'll see the old code bracketed out to be deleted, or the old names, the new ones put in. So there isn't necessarily a policy change there. It would be a conforming change with those names. And that's also true in section 2 with conforming changes. Section 3 is chapter 4 of Title 21, 2104 is our residential, or is really defining all of our zoning districts. But for the residential zoning districts, you'll see that we have inserted each of the new districts, and then you'll see the bracketed language in all caps that's being repealed, and that's replacing those districts. So again, that's really a new updated version of what happens in the 2023 ordinance. And then again, we'll come back to R2D when we get there. But that one does appear currently in our CR, or I guess it would be CMRL district. But we are proposing to change that. So we'll come back to that. But you'll go through, and then you'll see also at the bottom there, commercial districts are addressed in the ordinance, but really just to change the district names, again, a conforming change. Then on to section 4. That really updates the use table, which is chapter 5. So again, has to show the new district names, what is permitted, either permitted by right or by conditional use, all the different levels of review that it might require. And then also in there, it removes some of the really specific standards for the R5 district around, for example, hotels, because again, that district would be repealed and replaced with single and two family. Next, you'll see on section 5, that's chapter 6, that has to do with some dimensional standards and the conforming changes. We'll have subsequent slides kind of going through there. And then the next section is chapter 7, or the residential design standards section. So you'll see that a lot of the language that was kind of buried in with each individual zoning district is actually relocated and streamlined into this chapter to make it more consistent with the way that chapter runs otherwise. And then you'll see some notes here. So we've got steep slope regulations, so moving those out of just R10 so that they would apply to other properties that have steep slopes rather than just being specific to that district. You'll see some conforming changes there. There's a lot of language around bonus provisions that allow you to increase housing density. So rather than having those, again, buried in one district, they would apply in certain situations, and they are documented here to be more consistent. And then, of course, you'll see a couple more conforming changes. I'll note at the bottom there, 2107 110F. This does allow multiple structures, or what's called a detached duplex, in all districts. So that is allowed in some districts already, but this would allow basically having two structures on a lot, and one of them would not have to be an accessory dwelling. It could really be, again, what they call a detached duplex. And so you'll see that reflected in the changes as well. Then lastly, on our sectional summary, we have a few more. We have the section 7 talks about cluster housing, again, really addressing that detached duplex part. Section 8 preserves, and section 11 preserves existing zones in Girdwood and Chugiak Eagle River. I think we made the point earlier, the home initiative does not specifically change Girdwood and Eagle River, but what we discovered is that a lot of the language in those other zoning areas is based on the Anchorage Bowl language. And so part of this is really preserving the code as it is now. Those communities can have the conversation about what might change in the future, but they are separate sections. And then we address legal nonconformities of existing lots. So that's standard language with any kind of rezone or land use change to make clear that it does not automatically require people to make changes. And then lastly is the effective date. And you'll see that the effective date right now says immediate upon passage. I'll just note that as currently written in the S version, because there was some confusion about this from the prior version, the AO 2023-87S is also effective upon passage. I think that's a conversation we can certainly have. There was a previous version that had some pieces go into effect January 1st, 2024, and then others January 1st, 2025 for different new zones. I just want to note that that is not in the S version. There was some confusion about that. And again, we are discussing kind of what those effective dates need to be, knowing that this is a big change and knowing that you know, our timeline is partly dependent on planning and zoning and when they take action, right? So so we are looking at potentially staggered effective dates. So you won't see that in the draft, but those are exactly the kind of things we want to have a conversation about and want to be realistic. So next, I'm gonna basically, Daniel and I will tag team and talk about each of the zones. So we've got kind of the big picture zone with the language around it, and then we'll go into comparing it with existing zones. So go ahead, Daniel.
Okay, great. Yeah, so this would be the first residential zone, single and two family residential. And one thing I'll point out about these zones, I don't think we have a map in this slideshow, but if folks check out the 2040 land use plan, you can see where all of these land use designations are already mapped. So there's a pattern here, and you could see, okay, I'm in R1A now. Well, where am I on the map? Okay, I'm going to be in single and two family residential. So the new purpose of this zone would be that it would be intended primarily for residential development with up to 8 dwelling units per acre. These areas generally have well-developed infrastructure and municipal services. This would replace the 4 zones that you see listed here: R1, R1A, R2, R2D. As Anna has pointed out, there are 2 land use designations sort of, I guess they span, where zones span multiple. So one is R2D. R2D is found in the 2040 plan in both the single and two family residential land use designation, and then also the compact mixed residential low. One of the conversations that the co-sponsors are having right now is, where should we put R2D? Should we put it in with the single and two family residential, or should we join it to R2M in the compact mixed residential low? The more I'm looking at this, and we've been working on this, the more I'm inclined to support putting it here in the R2 in the single and two family residential zone, and I think there's alignment with my co-sponsors on that. But again, that's something we want to hear public feedback about. So that would be the first residential zone, and then I guess we could go to the next slide. You want to go ahead and take this one, Anna?
Yeah, so, and I'll just briefly say, this is partly we included these so that you can help kind of translate what's in the ordinance to what we're looking at, right? And so I won't read through every number on this slide, but I want to orient you to these dimensional standards. Essentially, what we have at the top is the new proposed zoning district. And again, this is what you see in the draft ordinance. Not all of this detail is in 87S. And it's got the different uses. There is minimum lot area, so the minimum lot size that you can have to build. The minimum width for your lot, so that's usually the width facing the street, right? So you have to be a certain size, and that varies by district. Maximum lot coverage, so how much of your property can be buildings, and that also varies by district. The setbacks, so again, how far or close you can build to the edge of your lot line. Fronts, so the numbers here are the front setback here, 20 feet, the side setback, 5 feet, although it depends on if you have 0 lot lines or attached housing, and then rear setback of 10 feet. And then we have the number of main buildings, as I mentioned, that is the number of primary structures. So you'll see in single family, you can have 1, but other Other properties we're proposing allowing up to 2, and then of course maximum height of structures. And so what you're looking at for each of these slides that will go forward is the new zoning district at the top with those numbers in bold, and then comparing the range, basically the range of requirements for all of those existing districts that we're using. So here you're looking at R1, R1A, R2A, and R5, and then I made the note there at the bottom about R2D. So again, this is really to help folks really compare and get into the nitty gritty about what these new zones look like, and then how they compare to what's there now. So for each of these slides, we'll have that equivalent.
And Anna, before you move on from that slide, I wasn't quite quick enough. It's important to see that you'll see similar numbers in what's proposed from where it's coming from. So this is a piece we tried to stress earlier, is that we are only doing what the least restrictive thing is within the zones that are being consolidated. We're not proposing new standards that didn't exist previously. We're just simply saying if it's R1 through R2D and we look at any one of these standards, we're taking whatever the least restrictive standard is in most instances and is applying it to the consolidated zoning districts. So you'll see a lot of familiar numbers. It shouldn't seem substantially different because we're not changing kind of the core of what was already there. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Meg. And then I'll just note, for example, you see one family attached, 3,000 square feet. The logic here is that, if you've got attached housing, that can be a duplex, right? A detached duplex. And so 3,000 times 2 is 6,000. So again, really making sure that we're not necessarily copying the exact number below, because there is a range, as you can see, but making sure that we're thinking about what is practical and what is possible in these lots. So go ahead, Dan.
Okay, thank you. Also on that prior slide, I want to point out, I guess, that there's a big focus in the 2040 land use plan about being able to create more compact housing. And so I think that's a strong argument for the minimum lot area in particular. Thanks. We can go to the next slide. So here would be the next residential zone that we're proposing, compact mixed residential low. So here we're going up in density, intended primarily for residential development of up to 24 dwelling units per acre. These areas, again, generally have well-developed infrastructure and municipal services. Right now, as mentioned in the January draft that is in the packet that Planning and Zoning Commission has, by the way, folks can view that. It is written so that R2D would join R2M, but we're, again, looking at putting R2D in with a single and two family. So it would just be R2M that would be in this new proposed compact mixed residential low zone. And so again, you could look at the 2040 land use map. If you're in R2M, you would now be in compact mixed residential low when you look at that map. Next slide. And so
yeah,
here
and again,
are dimensional standards in the draft. So you can see here now we're expanding some uses, right? So the single and two family residential, you can only have a single family home or a duplex with an ADU. Here in this zone, compact mixed residential low, which is increased density. You can see how it's scaling up in density. And again, you can see the lot coverage, the setbacks, and the max height. So this is kind of just what we're putting out as a proposal, and then we want the community to weigh in again on those dimensional standards.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just briefly note here, again, we may be moving R2D, so we want to keep saying that over and over. But here we also can see that the existing R2M district does allow for multifamily up to 8 plexes too. So again, looking at ways to encourage mixed density. And then, of course, the minimum lot size actually does scale up. So you'll see these are kind of stacked together. You can see them in more detail in the actual ordinance. But for those kind of multifamily or things that are not one family attached or townhouses, you can have 6,000 square feet plus another 1,500 square feet per unit over 4 units. So you can see that the lot does need to scale up larger, which makes sense as you add more buildings to it to keep it in line with the required density.
I think you can just keep, if you want.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so the next one is compact mixed residential medium. So that one is corresponding to R3 and R3A. The biggest difference with R3A, I believe, is it allows some mixed uses, and so it has a little bit more flexibility there. But really looking at and again, this is also in the district location requirements in the code. It says areas that are designated that way is where those zones should be. So again, following what is in the land use plan map. And then I'll note on the next slide here, again, we have all of the different dimensions. It gets complicated depending on the size of building you're talking about, because again, this area is intended to have a mix of densities, and that's the way the current zoning is as well. And then you'll also just see that there's some level of detail that we did not carry forward. So for example, it's, with this R3, your side setback is 5 feet unless it's required to be 10. It's 20 feet unless you're on an alley for the rear setback, and then it can be 10. So some of this kind of nuance that, that we can talk about, maybe there is a valid reason to keep that, but it really, those are the kinds of things that make it more complicated when somebody looks at their underlying zoning district and then they start to see, sometimes there's things that are less restrictive. Often there's things that are more restrictive. So really trying to, again, just give more clarity in what is allowed on people's properties. And then again, you'll see that there's a mixed use option here because again, we, it's all through the land use plan and really through the comprehensive plan is wanting to see more kind of vibrant neighborhoods that can often include small scale commercial. And I can keep going, or if you want to talk about urban residential high. Okay. Okay. Okay, so then urban residential high, this is intended for residential development up to 50 dwelling units per acre. So it's really our highest density housing outside of something like downtown, which contemplates a wide variety of uses and kind of higher intensity buildings. It also allows for limited non-residential uses with mixed use developments. Again, we want to see neighborhoods that are not just vibrant places to live, but also have those kinds of amenities that that some of us already enjoy, right? In the Fire Island Daycare, its old location, actually both locations really, and other kind of amenities that bring people to neighborhoods. So these would be in areas that are allowed in R4, R4A, so that's already in our plan. And then I will move to our dimension slide so you can see proposing a more generous kind of minimum lot size, that these could be kind of smaller buildings closer together on small lots. It could be a larger lot with more density on it. There's a lot of options there. There is no minimum width and no maximum lot coverage, again, because we really want this area to, like our comprehensive plan says, be more urban, right? So you go to other places, even like downtown, where you've got a building might take up most of the city block. That is really the kind of typology that we're thinking, and that doesn't have to be high-rise buildings. It could really be, if you've been to cities like Chicago or San Francisco, where you've got kind of that commercial street with buildings that line either side, and it feels like an urban place. That's really what the zoning district is about, and that can often include things like apartments, condos, and something that we do want to see more of. And then I'll just note that we kept a lot of the height limits. For example, 60 feet is allowed in R4A, up to 90 feet, but it does require administrative site plan review. So again, staying consistent with a lot of what's already allowed. And then our last one, large lot residential. Daniel, do you want to cover this one, or do you want me to keep going? Okay. Okay. So, and this is our last of the 5 zones. So this one is really intended for the areas that, as we can think of right now, are more kind of what are characterized as suburban or rural. So places like hillside, like areas that are already zoned with these larger minimum lot sizes. They may or may not have water and sewer service, so there are some requirements there. And really, these are not the places that we would expect to see a lot of intensive development. sometimes for geographic reasons, but often just feasibility as well. So this is proposing to replace R6, R7, R8, R9, and R10. And then I'll just note the main differentiation with those different, the Rs other than R10 is really the minimum lot size. And so, you know, you'll see R7 allows for a half-acre lot, R8 requires 4-acre lots. So really there is gradation right now in terms of minimum lot size, but fundamentally, these are all, almost all, you know, one housing unit or less per acre. And then R10, of course, we talked about is alpine and slope. And so the main characteristics of that zone have to do with the specific things you think about with slope. That is not necessarily limited to R10. And so we really want to care for those areas and make sure that that we think about kind of what those protections need to be in terms of slope and grade. So here you'll see the kind of comparison. Like I said, the main, there are some differences in the current zoning around minimum, you know, width and things like that, but really it has to do with how big your lot can be. But fundamentally, they're all large lot properties that we would assume don't, as I said, don't necessarily have water and sewer. And so this is a way to compare. And then as we noted, the R10 rules are essentially referring here, it refers to a separate section of code. And then that is one that we carried forward as kind of alpine / slope considerations rather than attaching it to one zoning district. And then lastly, we have the use table. So so briefly, what you'll be looking at here, this is what's attached as Appendix A. It's part of what goes in Chapter 5, the use table, or you know, the allowed uses per zone. So the main thing to note here is that what you're seeing is that the existing zones are repealed, and then the equivalent uses are put in the yellow highlighted boxes here. But you'll see that it shows certain things are permitted. They might require site plan review. There's the code here at the top. And then really, again, just this is another piece of implementing this policy intent in the actual zoning code. And I'll see if Meg or Daniel, do you have other comments on that?
Nope, I think you covered it. Yeah, just those highlighted portions there are what we are proposing as the uses. And so we have residential uses. You'll see in single and two family, for instance, you can have a single family attached or single family detached. You can also have a two family dwelling, a mobile home dwelling. Manufactured would be conditional. Manufactured home community would be conditional use. And so I think probably, you know, if we compare that to the large lot residential, again, as Anna just covered, you know, you have to have the larger dimensions in that zone, but you could still have similar uses. So a single family home or a two family home, not large multifamily. You can't have a triplex or a fourplex. Compare that to our urban high, you know, that's meant for that really large multifamily, dense, walkable community. So again, guided by the land use designations that exist in the 2040 land use plan, I think that there's a really cool path to having more flexibility and universality, more predictability for builders, but also still having distinct neighborhoods and again, that gradation of density.
Really quick, I think just like with the dimensional standards, if you look here at what's being combined to create new zoning district, you won't see big shifts. Again, it's just taking what was already permitted and just putting them under a new designation, or if it was already, in most instances, a conditional use, transferring the conditional use, or if in that combined area, it was already permitted and conditional in one, we went with the least restrictive, and the least restrictive here is to presume permitting it as a by right use. So that's where you'll see how we consolidated those across. And this one's a little bit different. Instead of going up and down, you just got to look left to right to get to what's in between. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll note too that actually the use table has several pages because it covers, you know, there's a cross section of every single district and then every single type of use that's defined in the code. And so we didn't represent all of that here, but you'll also see there's commercial uses, industrial uses. There's many other pages. And so the bottom line is most of those don't apply to residential zoning. So that's what we focused on. But for those zones that would allow for mixed use, you'll want to look at those other pages because they would cover the same kind of commercial uses that are allowed now. But again, not all uses. Okay, so that is not the end of our presentation, but the end of all of the content. We know there's a lot in there, and we anticipate having a lot of discussion about what we've presented in the future. But for the meantime, we want to cover briefly how folks can be engaged in this process. Again, some of the key dates, and then making sure you have that information, as well as, again, reiterating our request and invitation for a conversation to schedule a meeting with you in the future. And then we will get to our Q&A, and we should have about 20 minutes for that. So just briefly, this is the key information. It was also sent out with our press release and will be included when we post the slides. The Planning and Zoning Commission meets Monday, March 18th at Lusac Library in the same chambers where the Assembly meets. From 5:30 to 6:30 is a work session with the Planning and Zoning Commission and the sponsors. So we'll be sharing basically a similar version of this presentation, having a discussion. And then at 6:30 is when the public hearing or the public meeting will start. So you're welcome to sit in on the work session. It is also public. But the time that you can provide testimony will be at that 6:30 meeting. So, so if you can't get there at 5:30, that's okay. 6:30 is really the key time for the public. And then we've also noted we reached out to the Federation of Community Councils and asked our letter and invitation to be distributed to all councils. We are also reaching out to a number of other community groups. And so we're in the process of doing that. As well as to individual councils. A few have already scheduled us, which is great. Thank you so much. And we look forward to more. We know there's very limited time between now and the 18th. And so our goal is not to talk to everybody before planning and zoning, but really, again, to have that conversation, because what will really matter is what goes before the Assembly this summer. And so that's what we're working toward, knowing that planning and zoning is part of that and needs to weigh in. But also just to note that it's not the end of the process, and really it's just a step along the way. So again, we want to talk with you. We have our contact information. We also sent out that press release, and we are easily available to schedule that meeting. So next, and again, we'll make sure these slides get posted as soon as possible. You can find and download a copy of Home, the full packet that is before planning and zoning. We have the link here. The case number for this is 2024-006. Or 0006. And that is in addition to the ordinance number. This is really what planning and zoning uses to track its own work that it moves through. So you can download the whole packet and also read information there. And then you can submit comments on the home initiative. So we're reminding folks too, this will go before the Assembly, and certainly we want to hear from you as the sponsors. We always want to encourage people to contact the Assembly. But because of the process we're engaging in, the next formal step for this particular piece, this ordinance, is to go through planning and zoning. So if you want to make sure that your comments are included in the planning and zoning packet and go to the commissioners and are included there, you really need to make sure that you provide your comments either online with the link that's provided there. It's also on the case itself, or you can email planning staff. So we have both Tom Davis and Ryan Yell from the Long Range Planning Division. They are the staff assigned to this, and we'll be making sure that folks' comments get in the packet. So again, it's not that we don't want to hear from you, but we want to make sure that your comments go to the right place at the right time. And so we really encourage folks to send their comments there before the 18th. Obviously, if you're watching this after the 18th, you are welcome to send your comments there, but I would also encourage sending them to the Assembly. But again, while it's at planning and zoning, that is the official step. And then finally, we'll just note there's our Assembly Focus on Housing webpage. We've been doing a lot of work, obviously, but we do have information about the home initiative there. That is where we will publish things like our FAQ, like any updated versions for discussion, as well as more information that we produce. So when we're collecting questions today, as I said, we're going to be posting an FAQ So we ask if you submit your questions today, as I see folks have been doing in the chat. You can email the sponsors and legislative services staff. Again, we'll have the emails at the end of this. And then also, please bring your questions to the community meetings. So we are not going to be able to prepare a written response to every single question, but what we are doing is trying to answer as many as we can. And also, the questions that you guys ask, I'm guessing a lot of folks will have some of the similar kind of questions, concerns, confusion. And so really that will help us prepare this kind of FAQ list that we will be proposing. And then also I'll note, if you have questions about your own property or your specific situation, or you're looking for zoning advice, that is not our role, certainly. We need to think about the implications for different properties, but we really encourage you to contact planning staff, because again, we do not give legal advice on individual properties. We can't speak to how folks interpret the current code. And so we really encourage that for consultation. So feel free to ask, but that might be the answer, and that's why, because we again are not in the zoning administration business. We are in the policy business. So with that, we have our Q&A. So I know folks have been submitting questions. Basically, what will happen is we have about 20 minutes, and then we have asked staff to I know they've been diligently copying over the questions as the start to our FAQ. And then I will turn it to Allie to jump in and kind of start fielding questions for us. Just throw it at us.
Excellent. Some great questions coming through in the chat. I'd like to start with some questions that came up around the graphic showing Mr. Lewis looking for housing near the school where he works. And so, Anna, if it's helpful to tap back to that slide, that could be I think a helpful point of reference. There are a couple of questions about this graphic, and so would maybe start with some of the choices made in pulling data to show somebody's experience like this. And so the question is, why do you use listing prices for home values rather than actual sales prices?
So in this graphic here, these are listed rents. And so I think that that's an important distinction here. And listed prices versus sales prices are tough because we're a non-disclosure state. So in the state of Alaska, you don't have to disclose what you ultimately bought a home for or sold a home for. So we really are stuck with listing prices. It's something we talk about with the municipal assessor every year as we talk about property taxes and property valuation. And what I think is really important here too is if you're going to talk about home ownership and rental access together, you have to pick some kind of constant, and it's the listing price that's putting it out into the market. And that's what we're talking about, is the access and buying power within the market. I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that.
I think that question might have come from Ms. Hanson. Hey, Deb, how's it going? Yeah, you were talking about the average listing price in the bottom there. Why do we do that versus the selling price?
Me, Daniel? Yes.
You.
Yeah, because listing prices have gone up way more than selling prices have.
I don't know if I would be able to generalize that in the same way. I think that there are also instances of where homes go for way over what they're listed for. But I think that's a note that we can take for as we continue to give presentations to the community going forward, maybe having the selling price there as well, if we can find an average.
And sponsors, that was just our intro question to this graphic. There are more questions, so let's dive into those. This graphic shows that Mr. Lewis is finding these market rental costs that are 20 to 25% above what he can afford. Do you anticipate that your proposal, if it is adopted by the Assembly and enacted, will create a sufficient supply of rental units that the influx would be able to drive those market rates down as much as 25% so that Mr. Lewis's needs could be met?
I can kind of start addressing that one. I think it's important to look at the housing market holistically, and we've been trying to do that, knowing that not, or I should say, any policy intervention that we have is going to hopefully fix part of the problem. It's not going to fix the entire problem across the spectrum. So one thing that we found really in Anchorage for many years is this concept of housing lock, or if you think of, there's the metaphor of the musical chairs, right? If there's not enough housing, then folks who maybe can actually afford more, in theory, they could afford a higher mortgage, but they can't afford the down payment, or they can't afford a unit that they can move into. They end up being stuck in housing that really is below what they could theoretically afford, or maybe is too small for their family, but they don't have a way to move up to the next level. And then on the other end, we've seen seniors, for example, who maybe they have decent income, or they have a great amount of equity in their home. Maybe they've paid off their mortgage. They want to downsize. They want to get something smaller, closer to downtown, whatever it is. And then basically they're finding that they can't afford anything in the market either. And so I think it's challenging, because what we're talking about is really thousands of individual decisions, economic situations, life stage, and then we can't dictate where people live, right? And so really what we're talking about is increasing the supply, adding chairs to the game, to use that musical chairs metaphor, to allow for all of those kind of complex, personal stories to work out. So it's not to say that if we change zoning, that this particular person will be able to find an apartment in the next year at that price point, but it means that it starts to unlock the situation that we've been in for so many years, which is that we're not adding enough housing, and then certainly we're not making enough housing available on the market. And I'll leave it to others if they want to respond.
So a really fine point on what Anna just said is it's supply and demand. We have pent up demand remaining in the rental market because they can't access the home ownership market. And we don't have new supply of rentals coming on. And so we're just stuck. And we have to do, I think, everything we can to get unstuck. And for me, where I think this proposal opens up can help us get unstuck is adaptive reuse, where gentle density is allowed. As Daniel had mentioned previously, we have smaller families in large homes. There's the opportunity for more types of infill development or adaptive reuse of existing homes. And so I do think it will have a positive effect. I also think that for a lot of folks, the individual homeowner who might be thinking about, well, do I want to put an ADU on my property? Or if I'm now in a single 2-family, could I possibly just do something with my existing structure? Those are two different mental leaps you have to make as a private person. And that's going to be a part of this too. It's not just about what developers are going to do. It's about individuals having a bit more agency and set of choices to contribute to the solution for me. And I do think we will see over time. I have lived in many an area around a university where definitely older, larger homes were adaptively reused for student housing or whatever it might be. And so I think that there are a lot of opportunities to unlock, and zoning is definitely one of those keys to unlocking it.
Yeah, I'll just say there's I think a established body of evidence that I guess provides that zoning reform or zoning can play, we're not going to see overnight change, right? And so a 25% decrease in 3 years, something like that, I don't think we're really going to see. Really, I think we're in a situation now where we are at more crisis level, where the question is, how are we going to stabilize? Not only how are we going to improve the situation, but Wharton has a study, The Impact of Zoning on Housing Affordability, and they put forward that the bulk of evidence examined indicates that zoning and other land use controls are responsible for prices in high-cost areas of the country. This indicates that restrictions on supply and new development not just high demand for certain regions, are responsible for the housing affordability problems that do exist. The results also suggest that if housing affordability advocates are interested in reducing housing cost, they would do well to start with zoning reform. In addition, the effect of upzoning on house prices and redevelopment premiums in Auckland, New Zealand is another paper. Their finding was that notably intensively developed properties decrease in value relative to similar dwellings that were not upzoned, showing that the large-scale upzoning had an immediate depreciative effect on pre-existing intensive housing. I think it's a conversation, as someone also commented in the chat, that is happening nationally, happening on the West Coast. We've seen examples of cities like Minneapolis who have ended single family zoning. And I will say that essentially that is one thing that this proposal does. Others may contend that we sort of already did that with the ADU ordinance, and that may be true. But Minneapolis has seen great results in terms of stabilizing housing prices and also a decrease in homelessness. So again, I think this is a tool. I think it's part of solving the issue, along with addressing short-term rentals, doing what we can to incentivize construction in certain areas of Anchorage, public-private partnerships, etc. It's not the be-all, end-all. It's not going to be the silver bullet. But I do think that allowing more density, but again, gradual density, a gradation in density, can be part of that solution.
Daniel, I think that is a great way to transition to the next question, which asks, how will the effectiveness of zoning changes be measured?
Well, I think there's a number of ways. Oh, okay. You go ahead, Anna.
No, go ahead. I'll follow it.
Okay, so I think there are a number of ways, and this will actually tie into another question I saw around rezones, right? So one of the ways to determine if zoning changes are effective are the things that are being changed, right? So one of the things to realize under the home initiative is a couple of these zones just really change the names. They don't change the underlying zoning district. It encapsulates an entire zoning district. So let's note that. And then two, the land use designations, right? I love that they're words. Compact mixed residential low. Do we see the development of compact mixed residential housing happen in compact mixed residential low, right? We should be able to see what the district is called. We recently had a conversation about what's happening in R2M because there was ordinance before us. And when we got the information about what's actually being built in R2M, it wasn't what R2M was intended for. And so I think there's a really easy set of metrics to take and look at to see, are we achieving those goals? And then back to rezones, how many rezones are we getting? Because rezones right now are limited to what is the adjacent zoning district, have to be on a lot of a certain size. And so are we able to bring down the number of rezones because we've expanded what's possible already with following what's in the land use designations, but not constraining it by a zone that doesn't allow that? Because if we can do that, we're saving a lot of money and time and effort and uncertainty for developers.
Yeah, and I'll just add a couple of points. Generally, in terms of how the Assembly is hoping and planning to measure the impact of all of the policy changes is we have a number of indicators in the Housing Action Plan. And so we are working with the building department and working with others who hold some of those numbers and can provide them in terms of number of housing units, number of units per building, number of ADUs, all of these things. So again, it's not just this ordinance, but really the goal is to see more housing built in Anchorage. Because if you've looked around and seen, there's a few properties, but they really stand out because they are new. And it's not normal or typical for a city to have almost no change, right, over a decade, except in a few places where they really stick out. And so so that is one thing really to look at, housing production overall. I think another thing to ask when talking about kind of what is the impact, I think often when there's changes proposed, the impact is brought or the question is really brought to the change, right? Like, what is the impact of this change? I think what we don't do a good job of is asking what is the impact of the status quo. And we talked about that a little bit, but really we have the track record of the last 10 years or so of this zoning code as it's currently written, especially for residential zoning. And we're not seeing the type of housing production that our market study called for in 2012, that none of our comprehensive plan, our land use plans called for, really not even the level of production that our district plans, often our district and neighborhood plans have called for. And so really we have to ask, why is that? Why are we falling behind? And again, I think it's not just recent answers like COVID, like cost of materials. There's something more there. And so I think we really have to ask, is the zoning code that we have doing the job that it's supposed to? And I think the sponsor's answer is we feel like there's ways that it can be improved. And the other thing that I will note in terms of cost, one thing we've seen recently is a couple of rezones of properties to B3. The reality is that the best zoning district to build housing in appears to be the B3 district, which is our generic commercial zone that also allows residential building. And so I think that in terms of impact, we have to ask ourselves, why are people who build housing for a living opting for B3 and opting even to go through the rezone process or looking for properties that already have that zoning when all of our residential zoning appears to be undesirable or does not allow them to do the projects that they want? And I'll use one example, Chibala Corners with Cook Inlet Housing, great multifamily property in a very deteriorated area of Spenard, really great reinvestment. They used B3 zoning because that was the thing that made it possible to do what they needed to do. And so I don't think that should be our goal. So again, we have to ask, what are the impacts of the status quo, not just what are the impacts of this proposed change?
We're kind of running short on time. I just wanted to point out, Anne had asked in the chat for me to share those links to the studies that I mentioned. And so I just put a list in there. I know Anne is a researcher, so there's some resources for you, a few things that I've been reading lately. Thanks.
Thanks, Daniel. And I will also add a plug. One of the questions was around posting the slides from the slideshow. And so I think we can close out the question and answers with this answer. The slides are posted to the Assembly website, and I will work with the sponsors as well to post this meeting recording, as well as the resources shared in the chat in a comprehensive way online as well. So you'll be able to return to it. And so with that, Anna, do you have any closing comments to wrap up?
Yeah, and I'll see if my co-sponsors do as well. I'm going to put up the slide again, the engage in the public process, and just note again, and again, we'll be posting the slides, but March 18th, please submit your comments to the Planning and Zoning Commission there. And thank you so much for the questions. I know there was a lot more questions in the chat than we were able to get to today. And really a lot of them are very substantive. And so we look forward to continuing to have those conversations. We want to take the time to think about our responses. And then also, as you have specific ways to improve this draft, improve this proposal, we look for those as well. So, we really want to find what is the best version of this that can move forward. Not saying that what we have written down right now is the perfect version. So again, just want to put a plug there, and then I'll see if the other sponsors have any closing comments.
Well, I'll just say nothing more from me. I appreciate the time and attention for those folks who joined us tonight, and I look forward to the conversation going forward.
Yep, the same. And, I think a couple of things to watch out for. One is the staff report from the planning department. It should be coming out here shortly. And we do fully expect it to address the proposed ordinance changes that we submitted in January. That's the conversation we've had with the planning department. What we understand will also be going before planning and zoning. I think there's been some confusion around that. And that I really look forward to. We have a meeting with the home builders this week and the ACDA and other groups. And if you have a group you'd like to suggest as well, get in touch with one of us, because we're trying to be very comprehensive, but we don't always know every possible group out there that might want to hear from us. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And then I'll just move us to our last slide, which is just to say thank you. So again, you can find the packet online, contact the sponsors, and then we also included the contact for legislative services staff. So that includes all of our small but mighty team of staff, and so they can help us with scheduling, and especially if there's reasons why we would want to put those on the public notice calendar as well. So some groups, have meetings that would be private, but others we are happy to do public forums or meet with you at a monthly meeting or schedule a special meeting, whatever you would like. And otherwise, that is our presentation tonight. So thank you again, and looking forward to speaking more about home with you.